I'm Helen Marie, your host of the I Don't Think We Talk Enough About podcast. Welcome to episode 5. And today I'm having the most nourishing conversation with Suzy Redding about debunking self-care as selfish, but with a twist of let's see the good in being selfish and the necessity and benefits for others in us actually being a little bit selfish. I hope you enjoy. Suzy, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you, Helen. It's always a joy to be in your company.
We know each other off of Instagram as well, don't we? And we met originally through Instagram, but we've taken it off of the platform. And you are such a great wealth of information, knowledge and gorgeousness and friendship to me. So I really do appreciate you spending some time here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation, Helen.
Today I've invited you on to talk about why we find it so difficult to meet our needs, prioritise ourselves, without this aspect of selfishness, dancing the whole way through us even deciding to meet our needs. And you talk about this quite a lot on your Instagram platform around, well, basically choosing yourself and advocating for yourself. Do you want to just give me a bit more context about that and why you find it so important and why you'd like to talk about it today?
Okay. I'm so thrilled I have this opportunity because I released Self-Care Revolution, I can't even remember how many years ago.
This is a book, one of your books.
That's my first book. It must have been nearly a decade ago.
Wow.
And it was one of the first titles on self-care. And since then, I've had the opportunity to keep writing on the same theme. I've written 10 books.
Suzy, that's amazing.
Awful lot of tips and tools and practices and concepts. And yet, while everyone's nodding in agreement about how important it is, people still don't feel it's okay to do it, right?
Okay.
Any attention that's turned inwards somehow feels selfish, to the point where I think we've forgotten what selfish actually means.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to pop in a definition there?
I'd love
of what,
to.
Yes.
Okay. So I think we can sort of trace it back to this. I think society demonizes selfishness and it teaches us to revere selflessness to the point where we are now sort of engaging in this black and white thinking where either we're a selfless person or we're a selfish person. And so what I hear time and time again from people that I work with, on social media is that you could spend your whole day tending to the needs lovingly of other people. And yet the moment that you think about your needs, even if it's for a nanosecond, we feel like that's selfish. Now that is not selfish. That is self-advocacy.
Yes.
That's where we are allowing our own needs, our own emotions, our own preferences, even our own pleasure. Let's go there. Our own pleasure to get a look in.
Yes.
Selfishness is where we are spending the lion's share on ourselves and not letting other people get a look in. Now, we can see how the two are vastly different, yet look at how we use that word selfishness when we apply it to ourselves compared to how we apply it to others.
I'm reminded here of a very good friend of mine who I admire deeply. And I would say to her, should we go for coffee today? Very good friend, by the way. And she would just say, no. Full stop. And that power that she had just to say no, didn't even give an explanation. And I wouldn't use her model, but I actually had an awful lot of respect for her use of the word no. And actually that's what comes up time and time again, isn't it? About meeting our needs, that ability to say no to others, to say yes to ourselves.
That's just so difficult to do, isn't it? When you look at how we've been raised, and this is what I hear so often in my consulting room. And I work with such a huge cross-section of people. You know, I'm working with people in the transition to motherhood. I'll work with CEOs. I do grief counselling. So it's like all walks of life. And yet the one common thread is this, I feel like there's this looming question mark over all of our heads of, are we a good person or not? Right.
Okay. Maybe, as I would say, that a renowned expert in self-care, Suzy, having probably coined the phrase very early on, particularly in the social media world, how do you define self-care?
Okay. So I think the simplest definition that I can offer up is that self-care is healthcare. Self-care is nourishment for the head, the heart and the body. But there's another little bit of it that I think can be helpful to sort of help tease apart what might be a crutch as opposed to what is the true act of nourishment. And that is self-care nurtures you in this moment. It helps you cope in this moment, but it also makes tomorrow easier. It also tends to your future self. Does a glass of wine constitute self-care? Well, if one glass of wine doesn't affect your sleep, that allows you to unwind and there's a sense of enjoyment, that is self-care. But if one glass of wine then turns into 2 and 3 and then a series of Breaking Bad, right, and a poor night's sleep, well then I would suggest that's not self-care. So I think that definition can be useful. And I think also it's important to say, I'm not suggesting that we live a life devoid of Netflix and red wine and chocolate. It's just understanding that quite a lot of those compensatory behaviours have their own energetic tax.
Yes.
And if we are solely relying on those things, it tends to lead to a bit of a downward spiral. So it's about, yes, enjoy your coffee, enjoy all of those things, but make sure that there is a breadth to how it is that we're taking care of ourselves and make sure that it's making tomorrow easier, because life is hard enough as it is, isn't it?
I absolutely love the way you said that. Self-care through a lens of making tomorrow easier. And with that, Suzy, is that intention that if we notice the self-care we're choosing is having a benefit, we can start to make better informed choices, can't we?
Yep.
So it's about being more aware of the impact of the things we're doing in our day that have an impact on us.
Absolutely. And that's so important, because if we're thinking that it's selfish to turn attention inwards, it's selfish to spend time on self, how on earth do we get to know ourselves? How on earth do we start to make these connections between I do this thing and it makes me feel this way?
I know.
Right? It's just such a fundamental part of being able to make empowered choices, is actually taking that time to focus on self.
If you're meeting a friend for lunch and you have a really tight deadline with work, so you've stayed up all night, you haven't slept properly because you're overworked and not been setting boundaries, you then wake up feeling groggy, you have a coffee, quick lift, but it doesn't make you feel that wonderful. Don't you skip breakfast because you're feeling groggy. The anxiety kicks in with the coffee. You then don't make the healthy choice of going for the walk or getting your exercise in, whatever you choose to do for your self-care in the morning. And then you pitch up possibly late for your friend, stressed about what you haven't done. Whereas if we start to meet our own needs, set the boundaries, so with the work deadline, you have a good night's sleep, you wake up refreshed, make the healthy choices, you turn up to meet your friend from a fully present state, a regulated state. So I would say, how can that be selfish? Because you're actually giving more to others in the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a really useful thing, Helen, to actually start thinking about, what does self-care facilitate? What does nourishment facilitate? What does that turning of attention inwards facilitate in our lives? And how does that not just benefit us, but everyone our lives touches, not just our nearest and dearest, literally everyone that you come into connection with. And I think if we can just spell that out and be really clear, it helps us cope in the moment. Yeah, if we think of all of these self-care practices, these skills, because it's not just about doing something, it's a lens through which we see life, isn't it? It resources us so that we can cope with whatever it is as best possible. Now, there'll still be times when we get flawed by life, because that's the nature of being human, but it will give it a little protective buffer that maybe we won't stay down as long. It helps us get back up swifter. But it also gives us access to any of these qualities that we hold dear. And I think that's the biggest problem that I have with selflessness. And I think let's aim to be gloriously generous Let's aim to be kind and caring. But why must it be selfless? Because I actually see selflessness is the thing that interferes with my ability to step up as I aspire to. Because when I'm selfless, that's when I'm prioritizing everyone else's needs above my own. That's when I run myself ragged.
Yes.
That's when I overextend myself.
Yes.
That's when I start to fall into negative thinking. That's when I get depleted. And that's when I start making errors. And that's when I can't actually do the whole favor. I can't actually show up with compassion, with patience, because it's not humanly possible.
So why do you feel we're finding it just so hard to meet our own needs?
Okay. There are so many different threads to it.
I know.
And I'm still trying to untangle all of this in my head.
Okay.
I think if we take a look first at how we raise children, yeah?
Starting blocks.
Okay, so a good baby is one that doesn't cry. A good baby doesn't trouble its parents. A good baby is convenient, right?
I know.
Okay.
I felt that.
And it goes on. You know, you look at the kind of demands that are made of our children, that they can't just go to the loo when they need to. The message there is that their human needs don't matter. You look at the emphasis that's placed on attendance. So kids feel like they miss out on the rewards if they've got to take time off for bereavement or illness or injury or managing a chaotic home life. Yeah, they're doubly punished. They've already got those upheavals. And now they miss out on the pizza night, or they don't get to go up on stage and get the certificate.
I know.
Right? So that sense of push through. And it's perpetuated all throughout our entire lives with the good girl conditioning, the selfless mother. But it's not just gender conditioning. It's not just how we raise our kids. I can remember 20 years ago with the advent of positive psychology, feeling so enlivened by hearing about resilience, post-traumatic growth, savouring, gratitude, growth mindset. And I want to say there is tremendous value in learning these skills. But I think that these concepts are starting to become a little skewed.
Cool. Yeah.
Because
okay.
when I ask people what image comes to mind when I say the word resilience, people say to me, it sounds like, it feels like, the image in my mind is someone standing tall, hands on hips, you know, like a superhero stance with a cape billowing behind, with stress and loss and painful emotions just pinging from an impenetrable chest. So I think we just need to understand that resilience doesn't mean that we're unaffected by life.
No.
And coping doesn't mean that we're not struggling. The human response to challenging life experiences is to struggle. It's to have messy, challenging emotions. It's even to have perhaps some unhelpful thoughts. So all of these ideas of mental health being an absence of difficult thoughts and emotional health being perpetual happiness, all of this stuff it's so unhelpful. Resilience doesn't mean that we don't struggle or suffer from life's blows. It does mean that we get back up. So let's talk about what are the consequences. Now, when we are constantly prioritizing the needs of others above our own, but more than that, when we are negating our needs and when we're negating our right to feel, what impact does that have? Well, I would say that it affects absolutely every single layer of our functioning, right? It changes our behavior. It changes how we view ourselves. It has such a serious impact on our health, our quality of life. And it has a really serious impact on the authenticity and the health of our relationships, because if we're estranged from ourselves, if we've had to abandon ourselves to feel like we can show up in this world, how on earth can we ever connect meaningfully, honestly, with anyone else?
What kind of examples have you seen of, mental health consequences?
Anxiety,
Yes.
depression, burnout, overwhelm. And we see it in just feeling completely lost. This sense of, even if I had half an hour, I wouldn't even know what to do because I've forgotten. And that real sense of...
There's a sadness to that,
There
isn't
is.
there?
There's such a grief.
And so many people are talking more and more lately about not knowing what they actually really want, not feeling that those feelings of contentment, and not feeling like they're good enough, not feeling that this is what they thought life would be like. And that's desperately sad.
Yeah.
Because underneath that has been, well, for some of my clients, decades of not meeting their needs, meeting other people's needs over their own. So there's a huge fallout, isn't there, of being selfless.
Totally. And I think it's so important to acknowledge that real emptiness. And I think the other danger that we lay ourselves vulnerable to is resentment and anger. Because
yes.
we push it down, and then we become Vesuvius, and our loved ones are like, "What the heck? Where did that come from?"
Yeah.
Right? So it's toxic. It's toxic. Selflessness is not a virtue. Let's look at what is a virtue: kindness, compassion, generosity, care, tenderness. But can we expand our application of those values to also include ourselves?
Can we?
Yeah, we can.
And
we can.
Okay.
How do we do it?
How do we do
it? The $1 million question. So if selflessness is a coping mechanism, we can't just say to ourselves, "Oh, we'll stop doing that and look after yourself," because it doesn't feel safe to. That's the fundamental block. We need to be able to soothe our nervous systems so that we feel safe to be able to allow ourselves those kind of nurturing actions.
What are some effective tools from a psychologist's point of view, or some tips, to help individuals prioritise their needs?
Okay. So I think for us to be able to take action, it really helps us to identify purpose, right? Because if I just gave a breathing practice, or, you could try this time management technique, it just goes straight over. We've got to connect with, what is the purpose of this? Why are we doing this? So I would encourage people to think about maybe pick one role that's important to you in your life right now. Just choose one. Whether that's in the workplace or in your home life, just think about that role and ask yourself, how do you want to show up in that role? What kind of qualities are important to you? How do you want to be experienced? And if you can just articulate a couple. So, for example, in my role as a mum, I want to be present, I want to be available, and I'd really love to be patient. Okay? Then the question is, what do you need to be able to show up as that version of you? Mm-hmm. And that will help you identify what your needs are. Okay? Because it can be hard.
It can be, and it can be very hard for some to even identify their needs.
It can be hard. But when we see it through that lens of, I'm doing this thing, this act, I'm making time for myself in my diary to do this practice because it facilitates this thing in my life, then it becomes easier to actually follow through on that plan. It's easier to actively prioritize. It's easier to actually go and do that thing. Mm-hmm. So I'd suggest coming back to purpose. Then in terms of how do we actually do it? Well, then it comes back to goal setting theory and making sure that the intentions that we're making, are they reasonable? Do we actually have the resources available to be able to do that thing?
Yeah.
And that's why I'm such a fan of these, I call it a micro moment approach, where it doesn't have to be, I'm going to go and leave the house for an hour to do that thing. If you can carve the space and the freedom to do that, please, do it.
Yes.
But for so many of us, it needs to be a scaffolding of, I do this self-massage practice after I've brushed my teeth. I use this mantra. I use that breathing practice. I do this stretch. And in that way, if I look at my day, it's one tender gesture after another to help me step up and meet the demands of my day. This is how I resource myself.
Yes. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking it's building that self-care toolkit that works for you.
Yes.
And I have one final question, which I ask all of my guests, which is, what does it mean to choose you?
I love this question. I love it. I think It's a deliberate, conscious act where we come home to ourselves. That helps us know ourselves. It is then advocating for ourselves. It's expressing our thoughts, our needs, our emotions, our preferences, our opinions. And it's also learning to prioritise ourselves.
Gosh, I feel empowered by that answer. That was beautiful and incredibly nourished. That was wonderful. I loved that. Isn't it important to choose ourselves too?
So vital.
So, so important. Suzy, it's been just so gorgeous to have you on the podcast. And I'm so grateful for you sharing your wonderful words of wisdom and expertise. You are such a soulful, gorgeous person. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Helen. Thank you for helping me make sense of things. And that shared humanity, right? It's such a tonic. So I really mean that. Thank you for helping me make sense of things.
It's not easy.
Because it is hard to sort of, why do we feel this? What is that? How do we get through that?
I know.
So thank you. You honestly, you do. You help me make these connections. Thank you, my friend.
You're so welcome.